Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on civil protection here in Germany.
Yes, exactly.
You guys sent us some really interesting stuff for this one.
Yeah.
We've got news articles, analyses of both EU and national strategies, and some really thought-provoking discussions about emergency preparedness.
So right away, there's this kind of glaring discrepancy that jumps out at us. The EU just issued a new recommendation on March 26, 2025.
Okay.
And it says that every citizen should have an emergency supply stash for at least 72 hours.
72 hours.
Right. That includes drinking water, food, and basic survival things like a flashlight and matches.
Interesting. So let's just pause there for a sec, because Germany and Austria both already have their own recommendations in place, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Germany advises having a 10-day supply of food.
That's right.
5 days of water.
Uh-huh.
And Austria goes even further, recommending 10 to 14 days of general supplies. So what is this difference, like 3 days from the EU versus the national recommendations? What does that mean for us here in Germany?
Well, that's exactly the point, right? One of our sources, an expert named Franz, he raised the concern that this new lower minimum from the EU could actually end up undermining the higher national targets that we have.
Yeah.
He argued that we need to keep aiming for the higher nationally defined emergency supply level and not just settle for this new EU-wide minimum. Imagine you hear 3 days is enough, and then you might not actually prepare for the 10 days that you might actually need in an emergency.
Yeah, I totally see that. I mean, I can see people just thinking, oh, well, the EU says 3 days, that's probably good enough. But our sources also emphasize that the EU recommendation is really just a minimum standard, right? So why is it so important, especially for us here in Germany, to keep following the more comprehensive national recommendations?
Well, it's all about making sure our society can bounce back from a crisis. I mean, when you have a major natural disaster or some other kind of emergency situation, there has to be a basic level of supply for people, even if help from outside can't reach us immediately.
Right.
And having a smaller supply stash, just 72 hours worth, could seriously weaken our ability to get through those initial phases of an emergency.
Yeah.
I mean, the national recommendations we've had before aimed at covering longer periods, until help could arrive. So reducing that down to just the EU minimum, I mean, it could actually be counterproductive, giving people a false sense of security.
I see. And, something else struck me about the EU recommendations.
Yeah.
Within that 72-hour framework, they don't mention anything specific about things like medications, pets, or even shelters.
Right.
And, I mean, those are pretty crucial factors for a lot of people here in Germany.
Yeah. Absolutely crucial. I mean, those are often given much more thought in the national considerations and plans. And when we look at the actual deficiencies and weaknesses in German civil protection, these are some areas that really stand out. Take emergency shelters, for instance.
Right. And that seems to be a big difference compared to our neighbors in Austria. Germany only has shelters for something like 3% of the population.
Wow.
But Austria, they're way ahead, about 30%. That's a huge difference, isn't it?
It's a huge difference, yeah.
Are there historical reasons for that? Different priorities, maybe?
That's a really good question. Actually, a lot of the shelters we have in Germany, they date back to the Cold War era. So as you can imagine, that infrastructure might not be exactly up to date.
Makes sense.
Or regularly maintained. Now, Germany has announced plans to expand shelter capacity, maybe using things like basements and subway stations. But as of November 2024, our sources say those were still in development. Austria seems to be in a better position, like you mentioned. But even there, the question remains, would they have enough capacity in the event of really large-scale disasters that affect a huge area?
Right.
And would these shelters be accessible for everyone in the population?
Yeah, and that brings us back to the pets. Our sources indicate that the shelters might not be pet-friendly. And obviously, for a lot of pet owners here in Germany, that's a big concern if there's an evacuation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what happens to your beloved dog or cat? Are there any emergency plans that take pets into account at all?
That's a critical question, and there's no easy answer to that. Our sources don't mention any specific guidelines on how pets would be integrated into emergency plans or shelters in either Germany or Austria. So it's a definite gap. It creates a lot of uncertainty for people. I mean, imagine having to leave your pet behind in an emergency. That's a terrible thought. And it's a similar situation with medications.
Oh, yeah. That's another thing that jumped out at me from the sources. Especially for people with chronic illnesses, it's vital to have a sufficient supply of their medication, right?
Right.
Especially if those recommended emergency supply periods are longer.
Yes.
But who's making sure that someone who needs, let's say, a month's supply of meds can actually get it and store it? And is there any kind of support for people with low incomes who might find it really hard financially to stock up like that?
Those are all valid questions, and unfortunately, there aren't really clear answers yet. There are general recommendations to include medications in your emergency kit, but there's no specific guidance, especially for people with limited financial resources or storage space. Having enough for the recommended 10 days, it could be a real challenge for a lot of people. And another key factor here is this lack of uniform planning scenarios for all of Germany.
The sources mentioned this thing called an Auslegung scenario, which I think means planning scenario. Could you explain what that is and why it's so important for effective emergency preparedness in Germany?
Sure. Think of an Auslegung scenario as a shared script for emergencies. It defines, in detail, the type and scale of threat that civil protection measures across all sectors should be designed to handle. Without this unified scenario, there's no clear guiding principle to direct those preparations and actions at all levels.
Right.
This inevitably leads to problems like unclear objectives, inconsistent preparations, which we see with those different recommendations for emergency supplies, and also a lack of coordination between different agencies and organizations, inadequate risk assessment, and ultimately less public awareness.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. If you don't know exactly what you're preparing for, you're bound to have different approaches and uncoordinated responses. So those varying recommendations for the length of our emergency supplies are just a symptom of this bigger problem. This lack of shared understanding of the potential threats we need to be ready for.
Exactly. And our sources actually propose a specific potential unified planning scenario. A large-scale natural disaster, like an extreme flood that could disrupt essential services for up to 10 days. The devastating floods in Europe back in 2021 would be a sad but very fitting example of the potential impact.
Wow.
Having this kind of shared scenario would be hugely helpful in unifying the planning efforts, making resource allocation more efficient, and improving communication with the public.
Okay, so we've identified some pretty significant weaknesses in German civil protection. Differences in those emergency supply recommendations, limited and partly outdated shelter capacity, a lack of clear guidelines for handling pets and ensuring medication supplies, and that absence of a unified planning scenario. But our sources also point to a potential solution, a pretty innovative one. Increased use of artificial intelligence. This is where it gets really interesting.
It does. The idea is that AI could provide much more tailored civil protection advice compared to the traditional one-size-fits-all approach. Imagine an intelligent software that analyzes your exact location. Maybe you're in a known flood zone. It takes into account the size of your family and your specific needs, like chronic illnesses or the fact that you have pets. Based on this data, the AI could give you customized recommendations that go way beyond those basic minimum standards.
That sounds incredibly promising. So not just the standard 72-hour basic kit advice, but specific, personalized tips for my unique situation. How could AI actually support us during an emergency?
Well, that's where AI's ability to process massive amounts of real-time data and analyze it super quickly comes in. During an acute crisis, an AI could send out up-to-the-minute alerts and specific instructions directly to your mobile phone or other devices. That's a huge advantage compared to static information from traditional sources, which can't adapt to the dynamically evolving situation. Plus, AI can spot complex patterns in the data, and it can even learn and refine its recommendations over time.
Are there any real-world examples of AI applications in civil protection, maybe internationally?
There are. One of our sources mentions the Ready Stash app, which uses AI to give smart recommendations for putting together your emergency supply kit and creating personalized emergency plans.
Cool.
And Greece is working on a really ambitious, large-scale AI-based civil protection system called Aegis for comprehensive disaster management. You can check those out at readystash.com. And for the Greek one, you can find more detailed info at argophilia.com/relate mercy assimil-protection AI 241026. Definitely worth a look if you're interested in those promising approaches.
That is fascinating. But of course, whenever we talked about using AI, there are always important things to consider, especially data privacy and the potential for errors in those systems.
Absolutely. Protecting sensitive personal data is, of course, a major concern when AI is used for such personalized advice. The possibility of errors in complex AI systems is also a real issue. And we need to ensure that these technologies are accessible and understandable to all citizens, regardless of their tech skills or economic situation. And we can't ignore the potential danger of becoming too reliant on such technologies. What happens if the system crashes or isn't available?
Those are really crucial points to keep in mind. But it does sound like AI has enormous potential to significantly improve civil protection in Germany in the future, making it more individualized, preventive, and ultimately more effective. As we wrap up our discussion today, I want to come back to personal responsibility. Our sources stress repeatedly that government recommendations only form a foundation.
That's right. That new EU recommendation for 72 hours is meant to do an absolute minimum. Both German and Austrian authorities strongly emphasize that citizens need to keep taking personal responsibility for their safety and prepare for longer-term crisis situations, aligning with those established national guidelines. Personal responsibility remains a key concept in civil protection.
Okay, let's recap the key takeaways from our deep dive today. We highlighted the striking tension between those new, somewhat minimalist EU recommendations and the more comprehensive national standards in Germany and Austria that have been in place for longer. We identified significant weaknesses in the current capacity and state of emergency shelters and in addressing the needs of vulnerable groups like pet owners and people reliant on medication.
Right.
The lack of a unified planning scenario for Germany further hampers coherent and effective preparation for potential crises.
Yes.
And we discussed the promising, but definitely challenging potential of using AI more extensively to shape civil protection in Germany going forward. What really becomes clear is that civil protection is an incredibly complex and dynamic field that requires constant adaptation and development. New technologies like AI offer exciting possibilities, but we need clear concepts, improved coordination, and the ongoing commitment of everyone involved.
Absolutely.
And that brings me to my final thought for you, our listener, here in Germany. Considering these discrepancies and the exciting potential of AI, what does truly adequate preparation for a potential crisis in our country look like for you personally? It's definitely food for thought, something worth pondering.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this edition of The Deep Dive.
Thanks, everyone.